Hello, U.S. history. We are back to quickly tear through one of the most consequential and shaping periods in this era in U.S. history, which is the opening portion of the 1960s and the Kennedy presidency. So it looks like a lot of notes, but we're going to see if we can do this nice and efficient, and we'll be able to, and positive to credit you for your time. So let's look at promises and pressures, Kennedy and crisis, new leadership for a new generation. So there's all these anxieties that we were talking about through the 1950s, and they're going to be handled one way or the other by new political leadership, because America, coming up in this election to replace Eisenhower, will be selecting its first 20th century president. The question is, who will this president be? It is going to either be Richard Milhous Nixon for the Republicans, okay, that's Richard Nixon, or it will be John F. Kennedy for the Democrats. Now, these guys are only 6 years apart, but they're both looking young and fresh, and they're hip in their respective parties, etc. All right. Kennedy was descended out of a political dynasty. Nixon had made his fame by being involved with the prosecution of Alger Hiss, our communist spy. He's an anti-communist guy involved with McCarthy, etc. So let's take a look at what happens. All right. Who would be the leader in this new start? Well, it was a really hard campaign. But in the end, it probably really was won because of this new medium of television. The fact that politics is being televised is going to start favoring politicians in ways that we really don't think of. Like, for instance, their appearance. And Kennedy was this young, dashing, handsome World War II veteran. Nixon, he appeared on TV. He's not real familiar with it. And he showed up. And he had been out campaigning hard, and he had these dark circles under his eyes, and he had 5 o'clock shadow, and he just looked rough. He refused to have makeup put on for television. And guess what? Old problems in the United States are suddenly going to be confronted by this new vision of leadership that is going to show up in the form of JFK. Nixon probably won a lot of this campaign and a lot of their debates, but JFK won the public's heart. America falls in love with John F. Kennedy, and he will be elected president of the United States. Now, here comes Eisenhower. All right, Eisenhower is going to deliver his farewell speech, and this has already been referenced. He comes out in his farewell speech, and he says, you know what? Let's look out as the American people for something called the military-industrial complex. Like, be afraid. So what is that? It is the manufacturers of war goods. By the time Eisenhower's president, we are spending more on the military. We're making more weapons than we were when Eisenhower was leading the Allied forces in World War II. And these weapon manufacturers are going to have a huge control over American foreign policy, our economics, and sometimes, in the interest of business, maybe missile manufacturers want to encourage America to get involved in war so they can sell more missiles. All right. And Eisenhower, he was afraid that this type of thing would destroy American freedom because he sees things like these policies of brinkmanship and the arms races where, America's building nuclear weapons, so Soviet Union builds nuclear weapons, and we're buying bases and, enlisting people. And he says, this is kind of scary stuff. And so he comes out and cautions everybody, because America was living in fear. There's all types of social unrest. This is also, as the civil rights movement is heating up, and fear of Sputnik and communists in space and all these different things. So there's a lot going on all at the same time. And Kennedy steps into the White House. In Kennedy's inaugural message, he pledges to protect America, to protect people's freedoms. And he comes out in that Kennedy way, and he says, we will pay any price, bear any burden. I can't do a Kennedy accent. We will meet any hardship. We will support any friend. We will oppose any foe in order to assure the survival and the success of liberty. You know what he's saying right here? He's saying, like, hey, We are going to continue confronting communism. All right, we will pay any price. We will bear any burden, the burden of, being at war. We'll meet any hardship. We'll support any friend. In other words, if you're part of NATO and you're standing up against communist spread, we've got your back in the United States. He also, in the same address, will look at the American people and say, hey, I know, things are hard out there, but ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. He asked the American people to, really to make a pledge of citizenship and to get out and to serve the country, to move America forward from some of the challenges that we're facing entering into the 1960s. And then we start facing a lot of challenges, okay? And so some of them we're going to talk about, some of them we'll come back and address. So what are some of these challenges? Well, Cold War is raging, and it is raging in Southeast Asia, all right? Korea had been the first conflict in Southeast Asia. I talked about that. We had this big fight in Korea for containment. And you know what? That's not the only thing that had been happening. President Eisenhower had also invested millions of dollars to contain the expansion of North Vietnamese communism as it was leaching down into democratic South Vietnam. All right. And this is kind of confusing because we've probably got in our heads this idea like, so here's North Vietnam up here. That's not a very good way to do this. So here's North Vietnam up here, and it is communist, and it is spreading and going further and further into the South and further into the South. Here's the thing that people kind of miss, and it was something that people missed in the 1960s as well. In this time period, it really felt like more people in Vietnam overall probably supported a turn to communism. The communist leader in Vietnam was a guy named Ho Chi Minh. He was really popular, but we had this whole foreign policy that at all costs we're going to stop communist expansion. All right, so and I'm finding quick ways to shorten this conversation. So by the 1960s, we're having a containment showdown in Southeast Asia, and you have this information here in your notes for you to go into this little chart and fill it out. Our showdown is now taking place in Vietnam. And so there are two sides to this Vietnam conflict. There is the North that is led by Ho Chi Minh, who is the communist leader, and they have a close alliance with China, which is a communist state under Chairman Mao's Communist Party that's right up above Vietnam. Now, in South Vietnam, that's further down, it's a little closer to where we had been in the Philippines and that kind of thing. They will be led by President Diem. President Diem was obviously, he was a president that stood up for democratic ideals and stuff like that. He was horribly unpopular in the South, though, because most people in Vietnam are Buddhist, and President Diem was Catholic, and there was persecution of Buddhists. And so there's all this personal stuff going on in Vietnam, but the United States enters on the side of South Vietnam to support the democratic government. The truth is this: what was going on in Vietnam was really a civil war, and we stuck our nose into it because we thought it was more about containment and the spread of communism. All right, so this is Vietnam, big deal. This is what's going on by the 1960s under Eisenhower. So Kennedy comes in, and by 1963, Kennedy starts to up the game. He says, you know what? He says, money is great and all, but I'm going to send 15,000 what he calls advisors, all right, advisors to South Vietnam to help out the South Vietnamese people. What these 15,000 advisors actually were U.S. Army Special Forces soldiers that are called the Green Berets, all right? And they were going to fight against communist guerrillas, and guerrillas are soldiers that are fighting in jungles and in streets that are entering into South Vietnam from North Vietnam, and they are called the Viet Cong. All right? And so I know that's a lot going on there, but, that's what happens. We send 15,000 soldiers over. So now we're pumping, millions of dollars. We got 15,000 soldiers in. You know what? It sounds like we might get sucked into an Asian war Well, let's see what happens. What's happening back on our side of the world? Well, in 1959, which is, the end of Eisenhower's presidency, the government of Cuba, which is an island that is located only 90 miles south off the coast of Florida, would be overthrown in a communist revolution that is led by a fella named Fidel Castro. This is Fidel Castro. He rules Cuba for decades and decades. Only died, within recent memory, 10, 15 years ago. This is a revolution. People hated Castro. People loved Castro. It's a conflicted thing. He was so tied to the communist government and the Soviet Union, he wore two watches. One has the time in Cuba. One has the time in Moscow, so he can coordinate with the Soviet Union, etc. If our whole national goal in foreign policy is containment, things aren't going very well. Since a country right off of our beach border in the southern hemisphere is now converting to a communist government. And so JFK enters into this environment, and he basically says, hey, guess what? Communism can't be allowed right off of our coast. So they take 1,400 Cubans who had fled Cuba because they didn't want to live under communism, and they train them under the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. You remember that's the spying agency that was started by Truman to counteract communism and that kind of stuff. And they train them to be soldiers to overthrow Castro's communist government. This is a fight for containment. And they're going to land on the southern side of Cuba right here at a place called the Bay of Pigs. All right. And they land on the southern shore, and these 1,400 people are going to lead this new revolution. They're going to get rid of Fidel Castro. There will not be any communist government right south of Florida. Unfortunately, this raid was a gigantic failure. 1,100 members of that force that our CIA had trained were either killed or captured. They failed to get rid of Castro. In fact, there were pictures of these Cuban nationals that we had trained that are paraded, down the streets, disarmed in front of all of these communist revolutionaries, while Castro gives speeches about how they're trying to overthrow the Cuban country and we're going to stand against these Americans, etc. Kennedy, and you see him up there, TV, both his friend, also your enemy. My man is sweating. He's on TV and he's like, and then, bad things happened, et cetera, but he takes the blame for it. But the failure of us to do anything in Cuba is going to leave the Cold War right here, right off the coast of the United States, and tensions incredibly high. I mean, you can sail from Cuba to Florida on an inflatable raft. That means that our containment philosophy is not going very well. All right. So we talked about what's going on in Asia with Kennedy, and then we talked about what's going on in the Western Hemisphere with Kennedy. My goodness, what is going on in Europe with our friend John F. Kennedy? So we're looking at the Cold War in Europe and the Berlin crisis. That's the blank in your notes. All right, your blank in your notes is Berlin. It is the Berlin crisis. All right. So, angered by this disaster in Cuba, the USSR, and you remember USSR means Soviet Union, asked the United States, look, you owe us something for this. This is ridiculous. You have to get out of the capital of Germany, Berlin. All right. So remember, Berlin is right here. It's in the Soviet zone of occupation. The rest of this is is Germany, or democratic, et cetera, allied with the United States, all this kind of stuff. So America is like, no, we're not going to do that. We had already won this containment fight. This has been a victory with the Berlin airlift. And so the tension gets so high that it leads to the building of a permanent barrier in Berlin, a wall. The building of walls, it's really more symbolic in a lot of ways than it is. I mean, you could build a wall that divides the city, I'm sure. But walls are more symbolic. They are symbolic of the division between these two forces of Soviet communism and American democracy. Okay. The name of this wall, and I'm sure some of you have already guessed it, will be the Berlin Wall. All right? The Berlin Wall. And the Berlin Wall is an incredible symbol of the Cold War. All right? It is a physical reminder. It is a physical reminder of, the Iron Curtain. It's something that's there. It's tangible. It's not a division of ideas. It's a division of stone. And the Soviets and the East Germans are going to patrol this with, machine guns, with barbed wire. It will become a militarized zone. These divisions spring up overnight. They start temporary and then they become permanent. You have, under the threat of death, you have this East German soldier that's allowing this small child to climb through the barbed wire to get back to his family because they divided in the middle of the day as like a sudden order. You have people that are looking into their own neighborhoods where they used to live or where they used to work, and they used to travel back and forth. And famously, you even have defections, where East German soldiers, take off at a run and try to dive over the wall so that they're not forever trapped on the communist side of this conflict. It is, a incredible division. The Berlin Wall was a visible symbol of the Iron Curtain. All right. And that is what makes it so important and so powerful, because it just is something that not just the Germans, but the world looked at as a split between the Eastern and Western halves of the world into these spheres of influence. Now, JFK responds to the Soviets by saying, look, you're going to take up these aggressions and we speed up this arms race, which, it just feels, incredible. But I mean, like, if you look at JFK, here is our fellow JFK right here. He comes into the presidency right here. Let me see if I can get a brighter pen. He comes into the presidency right here, and look what happens in his presidency. I mean, that is a sharp arc up, but it continues after him. This building of warheads, 10,000, 20,000, 30,000. The nuclear armament pileup is going through the roof. And then it's going to have some real close implications. American spy planes are flying over Cuba. Of course, we're spying on them. And they discover that in a further escalation of these hostilities between America and between the Soviet Union, that the Soviet Union had put nuclear missiles in Cuba aimed at the east coast of the United States, like right off of our shore. And they were, there. They were sitting there, and people argued back and forth about what does this mean? What's going to happen? Are they going to launch an attack? That fear is not gone in this environment. So JFK is going to impose a blockade over Cuba to stop there from being further Soviet arms shipments. And he demands that the missiles that are there are removed. And so here you see JFK, and you see, Khrushchev, that are, they're wrestling over the fate of the world. For 13 days in 1962, that blockade is going to stay there. And the world is going to wait tensely to see who blinks, who is going to actually pull out and disarm and allow this tension to go back so that, truthfully, civilization can survive. Look at the blast range. This blast, if those bombs were launched from Cuba, had the ability to impact the lives of 80 million people living in North America. All right, 80 million people. They could have hit New York, Salt Lake City, Denver, Chicago, Toronto, Miami, Washington, all these places. It's insane. And at the last minute, the idea of brinkmanship as a foreign policy, that we get right to the edge, to the brink of destruction, and then we pull back, it falls apart, because what happens if nobody blinks? And finally, the Soviet Union will remove the missiles from Cuba. And even though we didn't put it out there, we didn't advertise it, we didn't even tell the American people, we also are going to remove some of our missiles from the country of Turkey, that could hit the Soviet Union. Surely there was a little wink nod agreement, and war was avoided. But both sides, at the end of this in 1962, were very afraid. All right. And they were afraid because, hey, nobody wants to destroy the world. Nobody wants to launch nuclear weapons that kill civilian populations. Nobody wanted a nuclear war between the Soviet Union and between the United States. Khrushchev and Kennedy, they're sober men. They have children. They're, whatever. They're ideologically different. But what happens if somebody doesn't pull back? What if an unfit person gets control of the button? And so, it kind of starts resetting things and creating a little bit of a thaw in this terrible cold front. And so we get a new Kennedy and a new direction. Kennedy emerges from this incredibly tense, happenings as a more aware and serious leader, not reckless like he had been. Like this sobered him. All right. You think about 80 million lives in the crosshair of these nuclear weapons. All right. And so he comes out and he kind of starts taking America in a new direction in the early 1960s. So first of all, this whole idea of brinkmanship, you want to hear what's crazy about the 13 days while they're negotiating back and forth? They had no way to talk to each other. They are sending telegrams back and forth negotiating the Cuban Missile Crisis. Telegrams for 13 days while the whole world is waiting to see whether or not we all die in a fiery flash. Okay, so what does JFK do? He installs a hotline in the White House, a red phone. And when you pick that phone up, it rings on the desk of the premier of the Soviet Union, where they can talk back and forth in a time of crisis to avoid nuclear war. Like, imagine that somebody accidentally launches a missile and the next thing you know, the world is dead. That can't happen. And so this gives the ability of these two military and economic superpowers the ability to talk in the time of crisis. All right. The space race starts becoming more of a concentration instead of the arms race. NASA, the Soviet Union is going to beat America to putting a man in space. Garo Yepremian is going to be the first man in space. But Kennedy throws his support behind the American space program. The Soviets had won the first round with the launch of Sputnik. And they had won the first round by putting a man in space. But JFK promises that America will put a man on the moon by the end of the decade, by the end of the 1960s, and before the Soviets accomplished that feat. Why do we want to put a man on the moon? I don't know. So we can beat the Soviets. The space race continues throughout the 1960s. We will put a man into space in the 1960s. United States astronaut John Glenn, who is a future congressman in the United States, he will become the first American to orbit the Earth in space. That's a really cool accomplishment for us. Okay. So now we've got a guy in space. So we're catching up to you Soviets, not an arms race, but a space race. All right. And in 1969, even though Kennedy is not president at this time, American astronaut Neil Armstrong will fulfill Kennedy's promise. He will be the first person to step onto the surface of the moon. And he will look out and he will say, that is one small step for a man and one giant leap for mankind. Okay? Guess what? He's right. There was a huge scientific leap out of the NASA program. We get, whatever, inflatable tires, new plastics, heat-proof shields, aluminum foil, microwaves, GPS, contact lenses, lasers, dental care, all kinds of stuff comes out of NASA. I mean, we were trying to get to the moon, but the inventions that we got from it, man, they just revolutionized the world, and they launch us into a new environment of technology. But it was also a Cold War victory, and we can't forget this. This is us beating the Soviets, all right? The arms race, look, it doesn't go away. I mean, we saw that chart. I mean, arms keep going up. But for the first time, JFK will sit down at a table and will sign the first treaty to put a limit on global nuclear power. This is called the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. The treaty said that no nation that signs this can test nuclear weapons on the Earth's surface. Now, they can still test them. They can test them underground. They can test them underwater, but they can't just blow stuff up because they want to check out their missiles. This is actually a big deal because, people had been blowing stuff up to check out their missiles. So there's like nuclear fallout in all these various places around the world, radioactivity, people dying, fish, oceans, etc. But it's also a big idea that, countries like, the United States and Soviet Union, they can go to the table. They can sit down. They can work through their problems. And that might get us past the Cold War. Things start looking up for Kennedy. All right. They start looking up. And then a tragedy is going to take place. Kennedy is going to go to Dallas, Texas, because he wants to secure Southern voters for his reelection. And while he's riding in a convertible with his wife, a rifle shell will strike him in the head from an assassin's gun. And that is the bullet that ended the life of John F. Kennedy, November 11th, 1963. I'm sorry, November 22nd, 1963. JFK will be assassinated as he rides in his car with Jackie Kennedy. And the whole world is shocked. The whole world, what do you do? We were used to having civic heroes, and our presidents were our civic heroes. And that plays out on television. You see Jackie Kennedy walking out of the hospital with John F. Kennedy's brother and future presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy. She still has the blood on her pink dress from where her husband was shot in the head beside her in that car. She climbs onto Air Force One, and she stands behind and beside his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson. All right, a Texan himself, often called LBJ. All right, kind of like FDR, LBJ, as he is sworn in to immediately become the president of the United States, so that there is no lapse in the power structure of our government, and the nation as a whole will begin to mourn. All right. So this is the man that killed JFK. All right. His name is Lee Harvey Oswald. He was JFK's assassin. And 2 days later, while everybody in America is watching Oswald after he had been arrested for shooting JFK from the window of this book depository with a rifle, Oswald will be murdered on live TV by a man named Jack Ruby, all right, who is a owner of a car dealership and adult clubs in the Dallas area. And America will never get an answer to why Kennedy was killed by Lee Harvey Oswald. Nobody will ever get an answer to why the president was assassinated. But you know what did happen? Kennedy, who had been our hopes and our dreams, and in so many ways had stood for America, he was shot to death. And then, while we were watching TV to find out why, we watched a murder on live TV. And you know what? Americans didn't look away from the screens again for the next 50 years. All right. While civil rights protesters are sprayed by water hoses and dogs are turned on children, and Vietnam plays out across America's television screens, and planes fly into buildings on 9/11. We have become captivated by the horrors of the worst things that we have to offer. The direction of the nation will change with Kennedy's death. And JFK's assassination is also when really the innocence of America dies. Because in the Great Depression, we thought we'd pull through it. In World War II, we were fighting the bad guys. It was us and America and freedom against communism and totalitarianism in the Soviet Union. But now all of a sudden, the president's dead, and lots and lots of turmoil is about to grip the United States. and our country is in for a wild ride. Thank you so much. I know that was quite a bit of information for us to share about John F. Kennedy, but a lot happens during his presidency. I appreciate your time. We will return in our next class to take a deeper look at the containment war that takes place in Vietnam. Thank you so much, and I will see you next time.